The stained glass cast a blood-red glow across the altar, but the coldness in Roman's eyes was absolute. Hundreds of guests held their breath as he leaned into the microphone. He didn't whisper. He made sure the entire cathedral heard him. "I can't marry a nobody. You have nothing to offer this family." Just like that, the promise of a lifetime was reduced to collateral damage. But Roman forgot one thing. Nobodies have absolutely nothing to lose. The corset was tied too tight. That was Nora's first thought when the silence stretched on for a second. Too long. The air inside St. Jude's Cathedral was thick, suffocating beneath the heavy scent of incense and imported white lilies. Hundreds of eyes bored into her back. The organist had stopped playing minutes ago. The priest stood awkwardly with his hands hovering over the gold-trimmed Bible. Beside her stood Roman Castor. Roman was a man carved from granite and inherited violence. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit that cost more than the house Nora grew up in. His jaw was set, rigid and unmoving. He hadn't looked at her since she reached the top of the steps. He was looking past her, staring down the long center aisle toward the heavy oak doors at the back of the church. Nora's fingers tightened around her bouquet. The stems crushed against her palm. "Roman," she murmured, keeping her voice low enough that the microphone clipped to the priest's robes wouldn't pick it up. He didn't blink. He raised a hand, a subtle, sharp motion. From the front row, his underboss, Elias, gave a curt nod and stepped out of the pew. The synchronized shift of suits in the crowd signaled a change in the room's atmosphere. The air pressure dropped. The guests belonging to the Castor Syndicate sat up straighter, hands drifting casually toward the inside of their jackets. Across the aisle, the invited members of the rival Gallo family exchanged wary, calculating glances. Nora felt the cold seep through the satin of her dress. She was a civilian, an outsider, the daughter of a mid-level accountant who had died owing the Castor family a favor. Roman, taking her in, elevating her to his fiancée, had been a fairy tale built on a fault line. She knew who he was. She knew what he did in the dark. She just thought she was the one exception to his cruelty. Roman finally turned his head. His dark eyes met hers. There was no apology in them. There was barely even recognition. He took a half step back. The movement was small, but up on the altar it felt like a canyon splitting open between them. He reached forward and pulled the microphone from the priest's trembling hand. The speaker system whined with a sharp burst of static. The cathedral went dead silent. You could hear the wax dripping from the candelabras. "I am a man who builds empires," Roman said. His voice was a low, gravelly baritone that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. "An empire requires strong foundations. It requires blood, capital, and alliances that secure the future." Nora stopped breathing. Her heart hammered against the rigid boning of her dress. Roman looked at the crowd, addressing the sea of mobsters, politicians, and socialites. Then he looked at the patriarch of the Gallo family sitting in the third row. A silent, deadly transaction occurred in that split second of eye contact. A deal being finalized. Roman turned his gaze back to Nora. He didn't lower the microphone. "I can't marry a nobody," Roman said. The words cracked through the church like gunfire. "You have nothing to offer this family. This wedding is over." A collective gasp rippled through the pews. Someone in the back let out a sharp, mocking laugh. Whispers ignited like a brush fire, hissing and snapping in the cavernous space. Nora stood completely still. The humiliation didn't hit her in a wave. It struck her like a physical blow to the sternum, knocking the wind from her lungs. She looked at Roman, searching for a flicker of hesitation, a sign that this was a necessity he regretted. But his expression was closed. He had weighed her worth against his ambition, and she had come up empty. She was the sacrificial lamb, slaughtered to finalize a treaty with the gallows. He handed the microphone back to the priest. He didn't look at her again. He turned on his heel and walked down the side stairs of the altar, flanked instantly by Elias and 3 other armed men. Nora was left alone in the center of the altar. The heat of 100 staring eyes burned her skin. Pity from a few. Contempt from most. They were waiting for her to break. They were waiting for the hysterical sobs, the collapse of the fragile civilian girl who dared to think she could wear the crown of the underworld. Nora looked down at her left hand. The engagement ring, a massive, gaudy diamond that had always snagged on her sweaters, felt heavy. She pulled it off. She didn't throw it. She set it gently on the edge of the baptismal font next to the altar. The metal clinked softly against the marble. She turned and faced the aisle. The walk back down felt like 1,000 miles. Her legs moved mechanically. She kept her chin parallel to the floor, her eyes locked on the heavy oak doors at the end of the church. She didn't rush. She didn't run. She walked with a slow, deliberate grace that forced the whispering crowd to quiet down as she passed. When she pushed through the heavy doors and stepped out onto the concrete steps of the cathedral, the cold city wind hit her face. It was raining. A grey, miserable downpour that instantly soaked her veil and plastered her hair to her cheeks. She reached up, ripped the veil from her head, and let it drop into a dirty puddle. She didn't look back at the church. She started walking down the street, her white dress dragging through the grit and oil of the pavement, blending into the grey city until she was completely gone. 3 months later, the Castor penthouse felt like a tomb. Roman stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring down at the grid of city lights bleeding into the rainy night. A glass of amber whiskey sat heavy in his hand. He took a sip. It tasted like ash. The alliance with the gallows was a rotting carcass. It had taken exactly 6 weeks for the cracks to show, and another 4 for the entire foundation to cave in. The gallows were sloppy. They bled money through bad gambling rackets and drew unnecessary attention from the feds. Roman had tied his pristine, disciplined organization to a sinking ship just to acquire control over the eastern shipping ports. Now, the ports were tied up in litigation, and his own lieutenants were growing restless. But it wasn't just the business that was failing. The silence in the penthouse was driving him insane. Roman turned away from the window and looked at the reading chair in the corner of his sprawling office. The leather was worn perfectly on the left armrest, right where Nora used to lean her elbow while she read thick, paperback novels. He hadn't realized how much space she took up until she was gone. Nora had been quiet, but her presence was a dense gravity that kept his volatile world from spinning off its axis. When he came back from a drop with blood on his knuckles, she hadn't screamed or cowered. She had simply run the hot water, handed him a towel, and asked if he wanted dinner. She had balanced his ledgers. She had remembered his men's birthdays. She had known when to speak and when to pour the scotch. He had called her a nobody. He had genuinely believed she was disposable, a pleasant distraction that lacked the strategic value of a Mafia princess. He was a fool. The heavy mahogany door of his office clicked open. Elias stepped in, a thick manila folder gripped in his massive hand. Elias looked tired. The bags under his eyes were bruised purple from weeks of putting out fires the gallows had started. "We lost the shipment at Pier 4, Elias said, tossing the folder onto Roman's desk. It slid across the polished wood and stopped against a brass lamp. Feds raided the crates. Gallows' inside man tipped them off to save his own skin. Roman closed his eyes, the muscle in his jaw ticking. Clean it up. Burn the shell companies tied to that pier. cut the gallows out of the north side entirely. Elias nodded, but he didn't leave. He stood there, shifting his weight. There's something else. Roman opened his eyes. What? The offshore accounts, Elias said carefully. The ones the old man left in a mess before he died. The Fed started digging into them last week. We were about to take a massive hit. Were? Roman asked, his voice hardening. They're clean, Elias said. He sounded entirely baffled. Someone restructured the routing numbers, buried the paper trail through a dozen dummy corporations in the Caymans, and set up a firewall that the Feds can't even touch. It was done months ago. Roman stared at him. He knew exactly who handled the private books. Nora, Elias nodded slowly. She spent the 3 weeks before the wedding untangling your father's mess. She didn't tell anyone. She just fixed it. If she hadn't, you would be looking at federal indictments by tomorrow morning. Roman looked down at his glass. The ice clinked softly against the crystal. A phantom punch landed square in his gut. She had saved his life, his empire, his freedom, and she had done it right before he humiliated her in front of the entire city. Find her, Roman said. The command tore out of his throat, raw and sudden. Elias hesitated. It's been 3 months. She completely vanished. No credit cards, no cell phone pings. She took the cash from her personal safe and disappeared. I don't care if she's on the moon, Elias, Roman snarled, slamming his glass onto the desk. The whiskey sloshed over the rim. Put every man we have on the street. Grease the cops. Pay off the informants. Find her. 200 miles away, in a damp coastal town in Maine, Nora wiped a dirty rag across the laminate counter of a 24-hour diner. The neon sign in the window buzzed with a faulty wire, casting a flickering pink light over the empty booths. It was 2:00 a.m. Her feet ached, a dull, throbbing pain that settled deep in her bones after a 10-hour shift. She smelled like cheap coffee and stale fryer grease. She tossed the rag into the sink and leaned her hips against the counter, staring out at the rain-slicked highway. She went by Sarah now. She lived in a cramped, drafty studio apartment above a hardware store where the radiator banged loudly all night. She counted quarters to do her laundry. She ate toast for dinner twice a week to save cash. It was a hard, gritty, exhausted existence, and it was entirely hers. A trucker sitting in the corner booth raised his empty mug. Nora grabbed the glass pot from the burner and walked over, pouring the bitter black coffee to the brim. "Rough night, sweetheart?" the trucker asked, dropping a wrinkled $5 bill on the table. Nora looked at the money, then at the dark road outside. She thought of imported lilies, velvet pews, and a man who looked at her like she was dirt on his shoe. She felt the phantom weight of a diamond ring on her left hand. "No," Nora said, a small, genuine smile touching the corners of her mouth for the first time in months. "It's peaceful." She walked back to the counter, entirely unaware that a storm was already hunting her down. Finding a person in the modern world is an exercise in data collection. People leave digital footprints the size of craters. They swipe credit cards for coffee. They log into bank apps. They pass through facial recognition cameras at toll booths and subway stations. Roman's network of hackers and paid informants could track a cartel ghost across international borders in 3 days. Finding Nora took them 5 weeks, and it nearly broke the syndicate. The command center was set up in the basement of one of Roman's clubs. The air smelled of burnt coffee and ozone from overheating servers. 4 of Elias's best digital trackers sat in front of glowing monitors, their eyes red-rimmed and bloodshot. Roman paced behind them. He hadn't slept more than 3 hours a night since Elias dropped that folder on his desk. He was losing weight. The sharp angles of his face looked less like a GQ cover and more like a skull pulling through the skin. Nothing. The lead hacker, a kid named Wyatt, muttered, rubbing his temples. I've run her social security number through every federal, state, and private database. I've checked flight manifests, train tickets, bus routes out of the city. It's a complete blackout. People don't just vanish, Wyatt, Roman snapped. His voice was a rasp. She walked out of the cathedral in a wedding dress. She didn't dissolve into the pavement. She didn't have to, Elias said from the doorway. He walked into the basement, tossing a thick stack of printed ledgers onto the metal table. She didn't run like a criminal. She erased herself like an accountant. Roman stopped pacing. He looked at the ledgers. Explain. Elias opened the top file. I stopped looking for Nora and started looking at how she operated when she handled your father's books. She didn't just hide money. She understood the algorithms the feds use to flag anomalies. She knew how to make things look boring. So I stopped looking for spikes in data. I started looking for voids. Elias pointed a thick finger at a highlighted row of numbers. She had a private account, completely legal, separate from the family. 3 days before the wedding, the balance dropped to 0. She didn't transfer it. She didn't write a check. She went to 5 different banks over 2 weeks and withdrew cash in increments of $9,000, just under the $10,000 limit that triggers a federal report. Roman stared at the numbers, the precision of it, the quiet, calculated foresight. She had been preparing her exit long before he ever stood at the altar. Did she know? Did she sense his betrayal before he even finalized it with the gallows? The thought twisted like a knife in his ribs. Where did the cash go? Roman asked. Into the wind, Elias replied. But cash runs out. She has a specific skill set, Roman. She fixes numbers. I had the guys write a script scanning local IRS filings for small businesses on the East Coast. We looked for a specific forensic signature. A sudden, miraculous cleanup of debt in failing businesses. We found 3. 2 were dead ends. The 3rd was filed yesterday. Elias slid a blurry photograph across the table. It was a still frame from a traffic camera in a town called Oak Haven, Maine. The resolution was terrible. The rain distorted the lens. But Roman would know the slope of those shoulders anywhere. She was walking out of a hardware store, carrying a paper grocery bag. She wore a cheap, oversized canvas jacket. Her hair was cut shorter, grazing her collarbone, tucked behind her ears. Roman's chest tightened. The breath hitched in his throat. It was a physical reaction, involuntary and violent. "Oak Haven," Roman said softly. "Get the cars ready." 300 miles north, Nora sat at a booth in the back of the diner. It was 3 in the afternoon, the dead zone between the lunch rush and the dinner crowd. The diner was empty except for Arthur, the owner, who was currently burying his face in his hands over a stack of red-inked invoices. Arthur was a good man. He had hired her with no references and paid her under the table for the first month. He also had no idea how to run a business. He was bleeding money to local vendors who were overcharging him for produce and meat, taking advantage of his terrible bookkeeping. Nora slid into the booth across from him. She pulled the stack of invoices out of his hands. "Sarah, don't," Arthur groaned, rubbing his tired eyes. "It's a mess. I'm going to have to sell the grills to make payroll next week." "You aren't selling anything," Nora said. She pulled a pen from her apron pocket and flipped the first invoice over. She didn't need a calculator. The numbers danced in her head, aligning perfectly into columns and rows. "Your meat supplier is charging you a 20% markup on delivery fees. That violates the contract you signed in 2022. I read it in your filing cabinet yesterday." Arthur blinked. "You read my contracts?" "I was bored," Nora lied. She started crossing out numbers, writing new ones in the margins with sharp, decisive strokes. Call him. Tell him you're auditing the last 6 months of deliveries and you expect a credit to your account by Friday, or you're reporting him to the State Commerce Board for predatory pricing. I can't say that, Arthur stammered. He's a rough guy. Nora didn't look up. He's a bully, Arthur. Bullies fold when you show them the math. Do it. She spent the next hour restructuring his payroll, cutting dead weight from his overhead, and finding enough tax loopholes in the state code to save him $4,000 by the end of the quarter. When she finally set the pen down, Arthur was staring at her like she had just parted the Red Sea. "Who are you?" he asked quietly. Nora looked at the organized stacks of paper. She felt a familiar hum in her veins, the quiet satisfaction of creating order out of chaos. "I'm just a waitress," she said. She stood up, tying her apron tighter around her waist. "I need to prep the coffee stations for the evening shift." She walked back behind the counter. She didn't know that 3 black SUVs had just crossed the county line, cutting through the heavy Maine rain, heading straight for her door. The rain in Maine didn't fall. It drove. It lashed against the windshields of the SUVs like gravel. Roman sat in the back of the lead car, staring out at the blurred pine trees. His hands rested on his knees. He was perfectly still, but the kinetic energy vibrating off him made the air in the cabin heavy. Elias sat in the passenger seat, quietly tracking their GPS on a tablet. They bypassed the local police station. They bypassed the tourist traps near the harbor. They pulled onto a cracked, 2-lane highway that ran parallel to the coast. The neon sign of Arthur's Diner bled into the fog like a bruised eye. Pink and sputtering. "Park across the street," Roman ordered the driver. The vehicles rolled to a stop on the gravel shoulder. Roman didn't wait for his men to open the door. He shoved it open himself, stepping out into the freezing downpour. He wore a dark wool overcoat over his suit, his dress shoes immediately sinking into the mud. He didn't care. He stared at the diner windows. It was a run-down, aluminum-sided box, the kind of place people drove past without a second glance. The idea of Nora, who used to pour vintage wine in a $10 million penthouse, wiping grease off these counters, made a vain pulse in Roman's neck. "Boss," Elias said, stepping up behind him. Rain plastered his hair to his skull. "We secure the perimeter?" "No," Roman said. "Stay out here, all of you. Nobody comes inside unless I call for them." He crossed the asphalt. The rain soaked through his coat, chilling him to the bone, but he barely felt it. He reached the glass door and gripped the metal handle. He took a single, measured breath, steeling himself for the screaming, the tears, the thrown plates. He deserved it all. He was ready to take the hit, drag her to the car, and spend the rest of his life making it up to her. He pulled the door open. A small brass bell chimed overhead. The sound was painfully cheerful. The diner smelled of burnt sugar, black coffee, and old grease. Roman stepped onto the checkered linoleum floor. The place was mostly empty. A couple of teenagers sat in a booth near the jukebox. An old man was reading a newspaper at the far end of the counter. And there she was. Nora was standing behind the register, her back to him. She was wearing a faded blue uniform dress that hung off her frame, an apron tied around her waist. She was reaching up to wipe down the glass display of a pie case. Roman's heart slammed against his ribs. He couldn't speak. His throat was completely locked. He took a step forward. His wet shoes squeaked against the floor. Nora paused. She didn't turn around immediately. She finished wiping the glass, set the rag down on the counter, and slowly turned. Roman braced himself. She looked at him. Her face was entirely devoid of makeup. There were faint, purple shadows under her eyes. Her hands were raw and red from hot water. She looked tired, but as her eyes locked onto his, Roman realized with a sudden, horrifying clarity what was missing. There was no shock. There was no anger. There was no fear. There was absolutely nothing. She looked at him with the mild annoyance of a waitress dealing with a customer, tracking mud onto her clean floor. "We don't serve espresso," Nora said. Her voice was flat, calm, and perfectly even. "And you're dripping on the linoleum." Roman flinched. If she had picked up a steak knife and thrown it at his chest, it would have hurt less. "Nora," he breathed. The name scraped out of his throat. She picked up a menu from the stack next to the register and wiped a water ring off the counter. "My name is Sarah. Are you looking for a booth, or did you just come in to use the payphone?" He closed the distance between them, stopping right at the edge of the counter. He planted his hands on the laminate surface, leaning in close. He could smell the cheap soap on her skin, beneath the scent of coffee. "Stop," Roman said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous command that usually made men empty their bladders. "Stop this. I found you. It's over. You're coming home." Nora finally stopped moving. She looked down at his hands. His knuckles were white, gripping the counter so hard the laminate was groaning. She looked back up at his face. "Home," she repeated. The word sounded foreign in her mouth. "I made a mistake," Roman said. It was the first time in his 34 years of life he had ever spoken those words aloud. They tasted like copper. "The gallows were a liability. I was blind to the business, and I was blind to you. I know what you did with the accounts before you left. I know you saved me." "I didn't save you," Nora said quietly. "I balanced the books so the feds wouldn't freeze the assets while I was busy extracting my own cash. It was collateral benefit. Don't flatter yourself." Roman stared at her. The cold pragmatism in her voice was staggering. It wasn't an act. She wasn't playing hard to get. She had genuinely excised him from her emotional registry. "You're my fiancé," Roman gritted out, the panic finally starting to bleed through his iron composure. "You called me a nobody in front of 300 people, Nora said. She leaned forward, matching his posture. Her eyes were hard, flat, and unyielding. "You were right, Roman. I am a nobody. And nobodies don't have obligations to Mafia bosses. Now, are you going to order a cup of coffee? Or am I going to have to ask Arthur to call the sheriff?" Roman realized, with a sickening drop in his stomach, that dragging her out of here wasn't going to work. He could put her in the car. He could lock her in the penthouse. But the woman he had known, the quiet girl who warmed his bed and balanced his life, was dead. He had killed her at the altar. The woman standing in front of him now was someone entirely different. And for the first time in his life, Roman Castor didn't know what to do next. The silence between them was heavier than the main humidity. Roman Castor, a man who commanded an army of killers and dictated the underground economy of a major metropolis, stood frozen in front of a scratched laminate counter. He looked at Nora. He looked at the rag in her hand. He looked at the dull, exhausted resignation in her eyes. She wasn't pretending. The absolute worst-case scenario wasn't that she hated him. Hate required passion. Hate required an emotional tether. What Nora was looking at him with was total, unadulterated apathy. Roman slowly pulled his hands off the counter. He took a step back, the squeak of his wet leather shoes loud in the quiet diner. He didn't turn around. He didn't storm out. He walked to the nearest booth, a red vinyl seat patched with silver duct tape, and slid into it. Nora watched him. She didn't sigh. She didn't roll her eyes. She picked up a white ceramic mug, walked over to the coffee station, and filled it with the sludge that had been sitting on the burner for 3 hours. She walked over to his booth and set the mug down in front of him. The black liquid sloshed over the rim, staining the paper placemat. $3, Nora said. Roman reached inside his soaked wool coat. He pulled out a sleek black leather wallet. He didn't carry much cash, he rarely needed to, but he extracted a crisp $100 bill and placed it on the table. Nora looked at the bill. Then she looked at him. "I don't have change for 100, she said flatly, "and I don't take tips from ghosts." Roman flinched. The words were delivered without malice, which somehow made them cut deeper. She walked away, returning to the register. She rang up a phantom $3 charge, pulled 3 crumpled singles from her own apron pocket, and dropped them into the drawer. Roman stared at the coffee. He wrapped his hands around the cheap ceramic. It was scalding hot, grounding him to the painful reality of the room. He lifted the mug and took a drink. It tasted like burnt metal and stale dirt. He swallowed it without breaking eye contact with her back. The door to the kitchen swung open. Arthur stepped out, wiping his hands on a flour-dusted towel. He stopped short when he saw the towering man in the bespoke suit sitting in his dingy booth. Arthur's gaze darted to the black SUVs idling menacingly across the street in the rain. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. "Sarah," Arthur whispered loudly, scurrying over to the register. "Is there a problem?" "No, Arthur," Nora said, not looking up from the receipt tape she was replacing. "Just a customer passing through. He'll be leaving soon." "Right," Arthur said, eyeing Roman nervously. "Well, I need you in the back to help with the inventory. The freezer compressor is making that noise again." "I'll be right there." Nora didn't look at Roman again. She pushed through the swinging doors and disappeared into the kitchen. Roman sat in the booth for another 20 minutes. The coffee went ice cold. The teenagers by the jukebox finished their fries and left, giving him wide, terrified berths as they passed. The old man with the newspaper packed up and shuffled out into the rain. Eventually, Roman stood. He left the $100 bill on the table. When he pushed back out into the storm, the cold hit him like a physical blow, but it was nothing compared to the chill settling in his chest. He crossed the slick asphalt and pulled open the heavy door of the SUV. He climbed into the back seat. Elias turned around from the front passenger seat. The interior of the car was warm, smelling of expensive leather and gun oil. "Do we move in?" Elias asked, his hand resting near the radio on the console. "We can have her in the car in 30 seconds. No witnesses." "No," Roman said. His voice was hollow. He looked out the rain-streaked window at the pink neon sign. Elias frowned. "Boss, we didn't drive 300 miles to get a cup of coffee. The family needs her back. You need her back." "If we take her now," Roman said slowly, the realization hardening into absolute certainty. "We take a hostage, and a hostage will eventually burn this empire to the ground from the inside out. So what do we do?" Roman looked across the street. Next to the diner was a 2-story motel. It was run down, with peeling white paint and a vacancy sign that flickered pathetically in the wind. "Go book a room," Roman ordered. "Buy the whole floor. Actually, find the owner and buy the entire building." Elias stared at him. "You want to buy a roach motel in Maine?" "I want to stay," Roman said. He leaned his head back against the leather seat and closed his eyes. The image of Nora's flat, lifeless stare burned behind his eyelids. "Send the other 2 cars back to the city. Tell the lieutenants I'm extending my absence. You stay with me. Roman, the gallows are still pushing our borders in the South End. You can't just abandon the seat." "I said send them back, Elias." The command cracked like a whip in the confined space of the car. It was the voice of the boss, sharp and unyielding. Elias nodded once. He picked up the radio. Roman opened his eyes and looked back at the diner. He had spent his entire life taking what he wanted through force, fear, and leverage. But you couldn't leverage a woman who had already accepted that she had nothing to lose. He had stripped her of her dignity, her home, and her future. He had left her with a clean slate. If he wanted her back, he couldn't play the mob boss. He had to learn how to exist in her world. 3 days passed. The rain stopped, leaving Oakhaven wrapped in a thick, salty fog that clung to the pine trees and rusted street lamps. Roman had essentially turned the second floor of the Starlight Motel into a forward operating base. He conducted his syndicate's business via encrypted satellite phones and secure laptops. He ordered hits, restructured shipping routes, and squeezed politicians from a room that smelled faintly of mildew and cheap bleach, but his primary focus was the diner across the highway. He learned her schedule. She worked the closing shift, 3 in the afternoon until midnight. She lived in the small apartment above the hardware store, a mile down the road, and she walked to work every day. She didn't own an umbrella. She just wore that oversized canvas jacket, pulling the hood over her head. On the 4th afternoon, Roman decided to cross the street again. He didn't wear the suit this time. He wore dark jeans, heavy boots, and a black sweater. He looked less like a cartel kingpin and more like a wealthy, dangerous local. When he walked into the diner, it was relatively busy. A lunch rush of dock workers and mechanics filled the booths. Nora was balancing 3 plates on her left arm, pouring coffee with her right. She saw him enter. He saw the slight tightening of her jaw, a micro-expression that was gone as quickly as it appeared. He sat at the counter, taking an empty stool at the far end. Before Nora could approach him, the brass bell on the front door violently jingled. A massive, barrel-chested man stomped into the diner. He wore a heavy leather jacket and had a thick, unkempt beard. He smelled like raw meat and stale tobacco. "Arthur!" the man bellowed. His voice boomed over the clatter of silverware. "Get your scrawny ass out here!" The diner went quiet. The dock workers lowered their heads, suddenly very interested in their hash browns. Roman remained perfectly still, his eyes locked on the new arrival. Arthur pushed through the swinging kitchen doors, wiping his hands on a towel. He looked terrified. "Garrett," Arthur stammered. "Keep your voice down, please. We have customers." "I don't give a damn about your customers," Garrett sneered. He walked up to the counter, slamming a thick fist down on the laminate. The sugar shakers rattled. "I got a phone call from the State Commerce Board this morning. Someone filed a grievance about my delivery fees. Someone using your name." Well, you see, the contract." Arthur backed up, shrinking against the pie case. "The contract is whatever I say it is," Garrett roared. He reached over the counter, grabbing Arthur by the collar of his shirt. Roman's muscles coiled. Every instinct bred into him over a lifetime of violence screamed to stand up, grab Garrett by the back of the neck, and put his face through the nearest plate glass window. He shifted his weight, his boots planting firmly on the floor tiles. "Let him go, Garrett." The voice wasn't Roman's. It was calm. It was chillingly composed. Nora stepped out from behind the register. She walked down the length of the counter, stopping exactly 3 feet away from the massive meat supplier. She didn't look intimidated. She looked bored. Garrett scoffed, tightening his grip on Arthur's collar. "Mind your own business, waitress." "It is my business," Nora said. She pulled a folded piece of paper from her apron pocket and slapped it onto the counter. "I filed the grievance." Garrett narrowed his eyes, looking down at the paper, then back at Nora. "You stupid little girl. Do you know who I supply? Do you know what I can do to this rat trap of a diner?" "I know exactly who you supply," Nora said. Her voice carried clearly through the silent room. I also know that you've been double-billing the county school districts for frozen poultry, writing off the excess as spoilage, and funneling the profits through a shell company registered in your wife's maiden name in Delaware." Garrett froze. The color drained from his ruddy face. "I have the shipping manifests from the last 3 years," Nora continued, her tone conversational, as if she were reading the daily specials. "I have the tax returns of the shell company, and I have a neatly packaged envelope ready to be mailed to the IRS Criminal Investigation Division in Boston. It will take them approximately 4 days to freeze your assets and padlock your warehouse." Garrett slowly released Arthur's collar. He stared at Nora as if she had just grown a second head. "You," Garrett choked out. "You're bluffing." "Try me," Nora said. She leaned closer. The absolute lack of fear in her eyes was terrifying. It was a look Roman knew intimately. It was the look of someone who truly did not care if the world burned down around them. "You are going to refund Arthur the 20% markup you've been stealing from him for the last 2 years. You're going to honor the original pricing contract. And if you ever raise your voice in this diner again, I will ruin your life." "Do we have a deal?" Garrett swallowed hard. He looked at the paperwork on the counter, then at Nora's dead, unwavering stare. He didn't say a word. He took a step back, turned around, and walked out the door. The brass bell chimed weakly as it swung shut. The diner remained silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, the clatter of silverware resumed. The tension bled out of the room. Arthur slumped against the counter, breathing heavily. "Sarah, how did you—" "I told you," Nora said, picking up a rag and wiping the spot where Garrett had slammed his fist. "Bullies fold when you show them the math." Roman sat at the end of the counter, completely paralyzed. He was watching a masterclass in leverage. He realized with a sudden, crushing weight in his chest that Nora had never needed his protection. She had never been a fragile civilian. She had survived his brutal world not by hiding behind him, but by observing it, analyzing it, and mastering the mechanisms of power that operated beneath the surface. She wasn't a nobody. She was a weapon he had left on the altar. Nora finished wiping the counter and walked down to where Roman was sitting. She didn't look at him with triumph or pride. She just pulled her order pad from her pocket. "Coffee?" she asked. "No," Roman said quietly. He looked up at her, dropping every ounce of his pride, his armor and his arrogance on the sticky linoleum floor. "I want to talk." "I'm working," Nora said, turning away. "I'll wait," Roman said. And for the first time in his life, he meant it. Roman waited. He didn't check his watch. He didn't pull out his phone to field the dozens of urgent messages undoubtedly piling up from his lieutenants in the city. He sat on the vinyl stool at the end of the counter and watched the clock on the back wall tick off the hours. 5 o'clock brought the dinner rush, the diner filled with the clamor of heavy boots, tired laughter, and the clinking of cheap silverware. Roman sat perfectly still, a dark anchor in a sea of motion. He ordered nothing. He simply existed in her space, forcing himself to watch the grueling reality of the life she had chosen over him. He watched her carry trays stacked precariously high with heavy plates. He watched her smile patiently at a pair of elderly women who took 10 minutes to count out exact change in dimes and nickels. He saw the way she shifted her weight onto her right leg, favoring her left foot as the hours dragged on. It was an old habit, one she used to do after standing for hours at his lavish charity galas in stilettos. Now, she was doing it in orthopedics, wiping congealed ketchup off a laminate table. Every time she passed him, a cold draft followed in her wake. She didn't look at him. She didn't acknowledge his presence. She treated him with the absolute indifference of a fixture on the wall. By 10 o'clock, the diner emptied out. The neon sign outside sputtered in the fog. Arthur locked the cash register, gave Nora a tired wave, and walked out the back door. At 11:30, Nora grabbed a heavy industrial mop and a bucket of steaming, pine-scented water from the kitchen. She started at the far end of the diner, working her way toward the counter in slow, methodical sweeps. Roman watched the soapy water spread across the linoleum. When she reached his stool, she didn't stop. She pushed the wet mop head directly toward his expensive Italian leather boots. Roman lifted his feet, resting them on the chrome rung of the stool. It was a small, almost pathetic movement. The head of the Castor family, a man who commanded fear across the eastern seaboard, was lifting his feet so a waitress could mop the floor. "We're closed," Nora said, her voice flat, breaking a silence that had lasted for 7 hours. "I know," Roman replied. She turned her back to him, wringing the mop out in the yellow bucket. "Then you need to leave. I have to lock the door." Roman stood up. His joints were stiff. The diner was quiet, the only sound the hum of the ancient refrigerators in the back. He walked toward the front door, stopping just shy of the glass. He waited for her. Nora disappeared into the back, put the bucket away, and returned wearing her oversized canvas jacket. She flipped the open sign to closed, killed the main dining area lights, and stepped outside. Roman followed her into the freezing, damp Maine night. The fog rolled off the ocean, carrying the smell of salt and dead fish. Nora pulled a set of keys from her pocket and locked the deadbolt. She turned to face him, the collar of her jacket pulled up against the wind. In the pale light of the street lamp, she looked impossibly tired, but completely unbreakable. "You waited 7 hours," she said. It wasn't a question. It was an observation of a strange, useless phenomenon. "Why?" "Because you asked me for the time of day for 2 years, and I never gave it to you," Roman said. The words came out raw, scraped from the bottom of a chest that felt entirely hollowed out. "I thought I owed you at least 1 shift." Nora let out a short, breathy exhale that might have been a laugh if there had been any humor in it. "You don't owe me anything, Roman. The ledger is clear." "It's not clear." Roman stepped closer. He didn't reach for her. He knew better than to touch her. "The gallows. The treaty. I didn't do it to hurt you. I did it because the family was bleeding territory in the south, and Elias told me we needed the shipping lanes. I made a cold calculation. It was business. It was the worst mistake of my life, but it was just business." "I know it was business," Nora said quietly. "That's the part you don't understand." Roman frowned, the cold wind biting at his neck. "What?" "I never cared about the cruelty of your world," Nora said, her eyes locking onto his with a chilling clarity. "I balanced your books. I saw the blood money. I saw the payoffs to the coroner. I knew who you were. But I thought, in the middle of all that calculated violence, I was the one thing you viewed as human, the one thing that wasn't a transaction." She took a step closer to him, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "But you stood on that altar, and you proved that I was just another asset. You ran a cost-benefit analysis on my life, Roman. You weighed a shipping lane against my dignity, and you chose the shipping lane. You called me a nobody because, in your ledger, I had no capital." Roman felt the words hit him like physical blows. He opened his mouth, but the defense died in his throat. "She was exactly right. So I left," Nora continued, pulling her jacket tighter. "I took my zero balance and I walked away. I don't hate you. I just don't have any use for a man who only values me when he realizes I hold the keys to his vault." She turned away, walking down the cracked sidewalk toward the dark highway. Roman stood under the flickering neon sign, the ocean fog swallowing her silhouette. He had come here to apologize, to drag her back, to beg if he had to. But looking at her disappearing into the night, he realized the terrifying truth. He didn't just want his fiancée back. He wanted the woman who had just dismantled a corrupt supplier with a piece of paper. And that woman was never going to settle for being a Mafia boss's quiet, compliant wife. By 6 the next morning, the fog had thickened into a soup so dense you couldn't see the ocean from the highway. Roman was sitting in the cramped, mildew-scented motel room, staring at a map of Oakhaven spread across a flimsy laminate desk. He hadn't slept. The ghost of Nora's words echoed in his skull, looping endlessly. "You ran a cost-benefit analysis on my life." The heavy motel door abruptly swung open. Elias stepped inside, his massive frame blocking out the grey morning light. He locked the deadbolt behind him and checked the blinds. His face was grim. "We have a problem," Elias said, tossing a burner phone onto the bed. "A big one." Roman didn't look up from the map. "The gallows." "Yeah," Elias crossed his arms. "Your extended vacation didn't go unnoticed. The Gallo underboss realized you haven't been seen at the clubs or the ports in a week. They bought off one of our drivers. They tracked the GPS on the SUVs before we sent them back." Roman finally looked up, his jaw tightening. "Are they in Oakhaven?" "2 cars crossed the county line an hour ago," Elias confirmed. 4 men in each, heavily armed. They know you're isolated. They know you only kept me with you. It's a hit squad, Roman. They want to cut off the head of the snake while you're sitting in a tourist trap with no security detail." Roman stood up. The quiet introspection of the last few days evaporated, instantly replaced by the cold, tactical machinery of the boss. "Pack the room," Roman ordered, grabbing his holster from the nightstand and sliding his weapon into place. "We need to secure Nora. If they did their homework, they know she's the reason you brought me up here. They'll use her as leverage. Or worse, they'll just put a bullet in her to send a message." "Roman, we are outgunned 8-2, Elias warned. "We need to get out of the state now." "I am not leaving her here," Roman snarled. The air in the room dropped 10 degrees. "Get the car." 10 minutes later, the black SUV was tearing down the coastal highway. Roman stared out the window, his heart hammering a violent rhythm against his ribs. The hardware store where Nora lived was a mile away. They skidded to a halt in the gravel lot next to the store. The building was dark, the front sign unlit. Roman didn't wait for Elias. He drew his weapon, keeping it low against his leg, and took the exterior wooden stairs 2 at a time. The wood groaned under his weight. He reached the rusted screen door of her apartment. He raised his fist to pound on the wood, but before his knuckles could make contact, the door clicked open. Nora stood in the doorway. She was already dressed, wearing a thick grey sweater and dark jeans. She held a steaming mug of tea. She looked down at the gun in his hand, completely unbothered. "They're driving grey sedans with New York plates," Nora said calmly, taking a sip of her tea. They parked behind the abandoned fish cannery on Route 9 about 20 minutes ago." Roman stared at her, lowering the weapon slightly. "How the hell do you know that?" She turned and walked back into the apartment, leaving the door open. "Come inside and lock the door, Roman. You're broadcasting to the entire street." Roman stepped inside, Elias crowding in right behind him. The apartment was tiny, a single bed in the corner, a hot plate on a small counter, and a folding table set up by the window. On the folding table sat 3 laptops, all humming quietly, their screens filled with cascading lines of code local traffic camera feeds and banking ledgers. Roman holstered his gun, staring at the makeshift command center. "Nora, what is this?" She set her tea down on the table and tapped the keyboard of the center laptop. The screen shifted, bringing up a live feed of the abandoned cannery. 2 grey sedans were parked in the weeds. Men in dark jackets were standing in a circle, smoking cigarettes in the fog. "I tapped the town's traffic cameras my second week here," Nora said, her voice entirely devoid of panic. "Oak Haven has horrible municipal security. I also monitor the local police scanners and the maritime radio frequencies." Elias looked at the screens, his mouth slightly open. "You've been tracking who comes into town?" "I vanished with a substantial amount of untraceable cash," Nora said, looking at Elias as if he were slow. "I didn't know if Roman would send you to kill me, or if the feds would come looking for the missing accounts. Paranoia is just good accounting." She turned her attention back to Roman. "The gallows are sloppy. They paid for gas in Portland with a credit card linked to a shell company I used to launder money through. My system flagged the proximity alert at 5:00 a.m. Roman looked at the woman standing in front of him. The waitress uniform was gone. The exhausted civilian was gone. She was operating a surveillance net that rivaled his own lieutenant's, and she was doing it from a folding table in Maine. "They're coming here," Roman said, stepping toward her. "We need to get you in the car. We have a safer house in Boston." "I'm not going to Boston," Nora said. She picked up a small flash drive, resting next to the keyboard. She held it up in the dim light. "And you don't need a gun to handle the gallows." Roman stopped. "What is that?" "When I cleaned up your father's mess before the wedding, I found the gallows' entire offshore network," Nora explained, her tone conversational, clinical. "The route they use to move heroin money through the ports, the bribes to the customs officials, names, dates, account numbers. I compiled it all. I set it up on a dead man's switch." Roman's blood ran cold. The sheer magnitude of the weapon she was holding in her hand was staggering. If that information went to the feds, the Gallo family wouldn't just be crippled, they would be extinct by Friday. "You kept their ledgers?" Elias whispered. "I kept collateral," Nora corrected him. She looked directly at Roman, her eyes hard and unyielding. "I knew you were tying yourself to them. I knew they were unstable. I kept this in case they ever turned on you, and the fallout threatened me." She stepped forward and pressed the flash drive into Roman's palm. Her fingers were cold. "Call their boss," Nora commanded softly. "Tell him you have the exact routing numbers for the Cayman's accounts. Tell him if those sedans aren't out of Oak Haven in 10 minutes, the FBI gets an anonymous email with the encryption keys." Roman looked down at the small piece of plastic in his hand. It was heavier than any gun he had ever held. He looked up at Nora. She had just handed him the absolute destruction of his greatest enemy, not out of love, but out of pure, calculated survival. He wasn't her protector anymore. She was his armory. Roman didn't hesitate. He pulled the encrypted satellite phone from his coat, punching in a number he hadn't called since the alliance fractured. He hit speaker and set it on the folding table next to Nora's laptop. The line rang twice. A gravelly voice answered, thick with sleep and arrogance. "Custer, you're a hard man to locate these days." "Vincent," Roman said, his voice bleeding zero emotion. "I'm looking at a feed of your men idling behind an old cannery off Route 9. Tell them to turn the heaters on. The Maine fog is brutal." A heavy pause settled over the line. "I don't know what you're talking about, Roman. Sounds like you're losing your grip." "Let me read you a number, Vincent," Roman said, picking up the small flash drive. 7724-0981 Cayman. Sound familiar? How about 4143 Delaware, LLC? That's the shell company holding the deed to your mother's estate, funded entirely by skimmed heroin profits from Pier 4. The background noise on Vincent's end, The faint hum of a television, the clink of a glass, stopped completely. "I have every ledger, Vincent. I have the routing numbers and the digital signatures of your customs bribes. The file is formatted, encrypted, and sitting on a dead man's switch. If your men step out of those sedans, or if I lose cellular signal for more than 5 minutes, that file auto-forwards to the regional director of the FBI in Boston. You won't just go to federal prison. The cartels will gut you in the yard for losing their money." "You're bluffing," Vincent snarled. But the edge of panic was sharp and undeniable. "Look at your phone." Nora didn't wait for a cue. Her fingers flew across the keyboard. She isolated a single screenshot of Vincent's most guarded offshore account and texted it to his personal number through a burner relay. 2 seconds later, the satellite phone crackled with Vincent's ragged intake of breath. "You have 60 seconds to pull them back," Roman said. "Or I burn your family to the ground." He ended the call. They watched the digital clock on the laptop screen tick away the seconds. Beside it, the live feed of the abandoned cannery played in grainy black and white. For 30 seconds, the men just stood in the fog, smoking. Then, one man pulled out a phone, listened, and barked a command. The men scrambled into the sedans. Headlights cut through the mist, and the cars tore out of the gravel lot, speeding back toward the interstate. Elias let out a breath he sounded like he'd been holding for a decade. The massive underboss lowered his head to Nora in a gesture of profound, unadulterated respect. "I'll check the perimeter," Elias said quietly. "Make sure they didn't leave spotters." He slipped out the door, the rusted hinges whining in the damp air. The lock clicked shut behind him. The apartment was painfully quiet. The hiss of the radiator in the corner was the only sound. Roman looked at the flash drive in his hand, then placed it gently on the table. He looked at Nora. She was leaning against the counter, her arms crossed over her grey sweater, watching him with that same impenetrable stare. He had walked into this town expecting to find a broken woman. Instead, he had found a kingmaker. "You handed me the sword," Roman said. "I handed you a solution," Nora corrected. "I don't care about the sword, I just hate bad math. The gallows were bad math." Roman took a slow step toward her. He stopped a few feet away, respecting the boundary she had drawn. He stripped away the armor of the boss, leaving only the man who had torn his own life apart. "I thought power was holding the gun," Roman said softly, his eyes tracing the exhaustion in her face. "I thought a strong foundation was built on fear and territory. That's why I stood on that altar. I looked at you, and I saw someone soft. I was arrogant. I was blind." Nora simply listened, her expression guarded. "You didn't just survive my world, Nora. You operated it from the shadows while I took the credit." Roman swallowed hard. "I called you a nobody because I was terrified that if I admitted how much I needed you, I would be weak. But walking out of that church without you hollowed me out." "Words, Roman," Nora said flatly. "You're very good at them when your back is against the wall." "Then look at the actions," Roman countered, stepping inches from her. The gravity of his presence pulled at the air. "I'm not asking you to come back and be my quiet wife. I'm done hiding you behind the curtain." Nora's eyes narrowed slightly. "What are you offering?" "Partnership," Roman stated. "Equal footing. You take over the entire financial network. You run the logistics, the shell companies, the ports. I handle the street, you handle the infrastructure. No one answers to me without answering to you first." Nora stared at him. The cold apathy finally cracked, replaced by a genuine, calculating spark. "The entire financial network," she repeated slowly. "Including the Elias accounts? Including the political bribes?" "Everything," Roman said without hesitation. "I give you the keys to the vault. If I ever betray you again, you won't need a flash drive to ruin me. You'll be holding the empire in your hands." Nora looked down at his hands, then back up to his face. She didn't cry. She negotiated. "I restructure the northern ports," Nora said, her voice dropping into an icy, pragmatic tone. "We cut the remaining gallows out entirely, and I get final approval on all domestic alliances. You don't shake hands with a liability ever again without my signature." Roman felt a dark, violent thrill pull at his chest. He wasn't looking at a civilian. He was looking at his queen. "Done," Roman said. Nora let out a slow breath, the tension leaving her shoulders. She picked up the flash drive, slipped it into his coat pocket, her knuckles brushing his chest. "Then let's go home," she said. "We have a lot of work to do." And that is how a nobody becomes the most dangerous person in the room. Nora didn't just survive the ultimate betrayal, she weaponized it and forced Roman to surrender half his empire just to get her back. What did you think of Nora's final terms? Did she let him off too easy? Or did she execute the perfect power play? Let me know in the comments below. If you loved this deeply grounded Mafia drama, make sure to hit that like button, share this video with a friend, and subscribe for more intense storytelling.